I think that's a part of what's not that, as we talked about beforehand, not that this isn't an actual earthquake that's taking place, but why is it included in the story? Is Matthew's not just a geologist that's giving us historical information, but he's associating this earthquake with something big that's happening. And, growing up in Oklahoma, I don't recall ever as a kid growing up, and even through my young adulthood, experiencing an earthquake in Oklahoma. But I remember the first time that we were in Sapulpa and I experienced one, and it was weird to experience that for the first time. And we were all like, wait, what is that? What's going on? Until we figured out what it was. And I think that's a part of the purpose of including that here. It's to catch our attention, to say, hold on a second, what's going on here? This is weird. This is strange. We need to pay attention to this and figure out what this is.
Yeah, and I think that in that larger scope, when you referred to the way these particular sorts of signs are to grab our attention, I think it's okay to move to the place where, in a sense, the women in the story are going to experience a bit of their own earthquake. In other words, they've come to the tomb expecting one thing to find another. And it's not like they came and thought that the plastic flowers they had left last time they were there were secure, only to find out maybe the wind had gotten too high. And where did they go? They'd like to replace them. It's that there's something altogether different happened when they arrived at the tomb. I found it interesting too, Paul, that some actually read the description of an angel sitting on the stone was a reminder to those who would have been aware that it was the Roman authorities that were persuaded to put a seal and soldiers guarding the tomb out of fear that there might be grave robbing going on. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is that the disciples would never have, based on their religious understanding, would never have taken the body. So that was a manufacture of the adversaries and the enemies who anticipated what might happen should Jesus rise from the dead. They were preparing their fake news early on. So when we read that the angel is sitting on the rolled away stone that had been sealed there by the Roman authorities, it was also visual reminder that there was victory in Jesus's resurrection over those powers. So it's pretty pregnant with meaning and with a sense of what's going on, that their real lives were going to be impacted by the resurrection, not just some ethereal, in your head, ghost-like thing that was going to be someone's future. This is supposed to be an awareness that there's a very real material sense that the resurrection actually means something for the way Jesus's followers would live. So when we get to the women in verse 5, where the angel says to the women, don't be afraid, what do you suppose some of the things that would have come to mind that would have gripped them with fear? What would have been some of the things that we could imagine struck fear in their hearts at the sight of the rolled away stone?
Gosh, probably a lot of things. I mean, the fear that grave robbers had come. Mm-hmm. I, one of the things that I try to do in reading these stories, you and I grew up in church, and so we've heard these stories our entire lives, and we're conditioned by that familiarity with the stories to anticipate what's next. I mean, we know what's coming next, so we don't fear or we don't feel that same sense of what they may have felt when they experience that for the first time. So one of the things that I try to do to overcome that a little bit is to go back through this story and try as much as I can to read it as if I don't know what's coming next, as if I've never read the story before. And what would I be anticipating? What would, if that were me walking up on that tomb and I saw that stone rolled away, what would be going through my mind? Not that what's going through my mind is necessarily what was going through theirs, but I think it helps to clear away a little bit of the um, that familiarity that I have with the story, and helps me to understand a little bit of what they may have been thinking through. And so as I think, I mean, I would have probably thought the worst, that someone has come. I mean, this was sealed by Roman insignia, which means that if the seal is broken, man, there's some trouble.
Mhm.
Somebody, I mean, how did they get past the guards? Where did the guards go? Where are they now? Um, is he still in there, or has he been taken away? What exactly is going on here? So what if we were to go out to the cemetery where one of our grandparents was buried, and we were to start to walk up on it and see that somebody's dug up that hole? What is going on here? Is the casket still there? Are they still there? Is the old dead body still there? What's going on? And and where are the people that are supposed to be guarding this place and making sure things like this don't happen? I mean, a lot of things that um, I think would have been scrambling through my mind, and I think probably we're scrambling through the women's mind as well.
Sure. And much of what you describe, if we are able to put ourselves in, that particular frame of mind where we, even though we've read the story over and again, are trying to face it as though we don't know what happens next. What we do know is that um, all of the ways we would have, all of the ways our expectations of what we would find were locked up in our already given understanding. So that they would have walked up and seen a stone rolled away, and obviously fearing absent now, soldiers now absent, or also kind of bewildered by their own experience. Their minds wouldn't allow them to think anything outside of what they had already, how they'd already framed the way this works. And that might be a place where we talk about the fact that resurrection at about the time of Jesus was a new concept. Now, it doesn't mean that on this side of the resurrection, now a couple of thousand years almost removed, that we don't look back through the Old Testament, for instance, and we see and read and we think, oh, that sure sounds like it's pointing to a belief in resurrection. Oh, that really kind of maybe points to what we think we know about from this side of the New Testament. But the realities are that the idea of resurrection was new. It might have been maybe 1 or 2 centuries old. It wasn't as widely accepted as we would expect. And the features of their understanding of resurrection was what we find in John 11. And some of you may remember we were in that passage I think it was a couple of weeks ago. Sorry about the shaking. Let me see here. A couple of weeks ago, when we looked at the story of Lazarus, and in that story, when Martha was asked, if she believed in the resurrection, in her mind, what she was assenting to, what she was agreeing to, was that at the end, there would be a general resurrection. That is, there would be a resurrection of the dead, but like all at the same time. There was no concept, there was no idea that one person might be raised from the dead. And so it couldn't be something that she could conceive given her understanding of what had now been commonly understood in certain circles, that there would be a resurrection. But the idea that one person would be raised from the dead before all others even it just was an unthinkable thing. And so it maybe points to the fact that we human beings, if you allow, some things we used to hear as adolescent boys, you just need to get that out of your head. Because what that means is we've got something going on in the way we are assessing the world and our relationship to it. And we're thinking that, well, this is the way it is. It can't be changed. It can't be any different. There's no possibility. And in order to change that requires some sort of proof, some sort of altered sense, some rupture, some disruption. And you have to admit that here you are with the expectation of paying homage to the dead body of your Lord. And that's difficult enough to get your mind around, because you've already conceived that he wouldn't die before liberating them all from Rome. Now you're asking them to believe that this one person was raised from the dead. And so, Paul, I wonder, this is not, this might be a bit on the spot, though we kind of tickled it when we were talking before, but what would you see as an illustration, for instance, whether it would be an illustration that sometimes we Christians have a hard time getting our mind around things, or people that you have maybe had conversation with, that when you're telling them the good news, there seems to be some things that just are not conceivable to them because this just isn't something that they've ever set their mind to thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head of a great illustration of that. I was trying to be fairly intentional a minute ago, talking about, if that were me walking up on that situation, what would I be looking for? And I was kind of intentionally leaving out the notion that, did he rise from the dead? Because I don't think that was really in the sphere of what anything they expected. As far as that goes, I guess maybe the best illustration, there's a fellow at work that he's Muslim, and we sit next to each other at work, and we have regular conversations about God and faith and religion and whatnot. And there are a lot of times that we'll be having that conversation, and I may say something and it really makes him pause and think, that's a foreign concept to me. Tell me more about that, because I don't quite understand that. I mean, we have conceptions about how the world works, and honestly, if we were to go to the funeral of a loved one or a friend in the next month, I don't think that any of us would go with an anticipation that that person is going to sit up and come to life. We believe in the resurrection because we believe the scriptures, and we have witnesses, and we have 2,000 years of history, but we still live without a lot of, I think, without a lot of expectation that we're going to see something like that. And I mean, if something like that were to happen, I think I would not be expecting it for sure.
Right. And I think that is, and this is maybe something unplanned, but I think that is one of the difficulties of what we would consider as a delay. we talked about it with the promise, when we talked about Abram, for instance, and how many years his family would spend in Egypt. And then we know the story about wandering in the wilderness, and we know how long did it take them actually to have a king where there was a sense of peace and that they were maybe finally, coming to terms with the promise. It was David. So we're talking millennia from the time when the promise was first made, and then they finally felt like maybe, yeah, we're finally there, and it was short-lived. I mean, it was short-lived. David and then Solomon, and then boom, it's division, it's fighting, it's the threat of foreign powers, and now here we are, and we're on the other side a couple of millennia, and the delay seems to us formed in us an inconceivable notion that something could happen like this, like so much that even though we talk about a coming again, and we try to figure out, well, since it's been so long, like, did it mean something different than some real sort of return? And that leaves us that even at the place where some of us who, believe that may really indeed happen in the ways that we heard when we were kids, it's inconceivable to us today because, well, our experience of reality is that nothing like that happens. So it can lock even Christians into a way of thinking where the extraordinary things are disallowed. And so we try to find alternate meanings. So, the resurrection of Jesus becomes, kind of just a warmed over notion of, former pagan understandings of the cycles of nature, where all things are made new. Well, yeah, that's spring.
Well,
but
and those notions can be so firmly ingrained in us that even in the midst of the reality of them among us, we'll still deny it.
yeah.
I mean, I think of the two travelers on the road to Emmaus. They had just come from Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
They were believers, which, I mean, they must have been associating with the disciples. They
Mm-hmm.
must have heard the story of these women and their testimony that he was not there. They must have heard the story of the disciples in the upper room when Jesus appeared, and yet they're walking back to Emmaus and they still don't believe it because it's just not in their framework to believe that someone would rise from the dead like that.
Yeah, and so here the women are, their entire, understanding of the way the world works is just completely um, uh, ruptured right there on the spot. And so they get the word from the angel, he's not here, he is risen. Now go tell his disciples. And so what else do you do, right? So now that you've cracked open that hard nut that we call our heads, our brains, our whole, framework, now that that's been cracked, the idea that we should go tell somebody is pretty natural. That it reminds me of the occasions in the Bible where, Jesus would heal someone and say, don't tell anybody. I mean, that's almost like like Marley. Marley's at the point where, you want her to do something and she's like, I'm going to show you that I got a mind of my own. I'm not doing what you want me to do. So, you do a little grandparent reverse psychology and you say, don't do that. And the minute I say don't, I mean, here she comes. And so, it really proves in an odd sort of way that the prohibition actually creates the desire. And so here Jesus says, don't tell anybody. And it's like, wait a minute, I can't keep quiet about this. Now here the women, they're like so overwhelmed by the experience that the very idea that they would have to be told to go tell the disciples is a bit humorous. I mean, they are going to go do it. And so they do go tell the disciples, but before they get there, they're surprised by Jesus. And then Jesus gives them the second do not fear there in verse 10. And they came to him, took hold of his feet and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. there they will see me. So the first announcement was made, and then they're doing what's natural. Yes, I'll go do what you tell me because I was going to go do that anyway. And then they're interrupted in their journey, evidently right there close, by Jesus himself. Go tell my disciples, here's where I will meet them. Now, we've had don't be afraid twice, one from the angels and one from Jesus. So is the reality that they hear this twice, that there's a sense that their fears are still sustained by the overwhelming nature of what they've just seen and what they've heard, or is it, or do you think it's really an affirmation? See, there's no need to be afraid anymore.
Maybe a little of both. When your frame of reference is disrupted in a way like this, it takes a while for you to work through that and figure that out, because you're asking yourself now a lot, what does this mean? And I mean, because something like this would change everything. Mm-hmm. You know, 30 years later, the Apostle Paul is going to say to the Corinthians that if this isn't real, mm-hmm. then we are more than anyone else to be, I mean, what we're about is useless. Mm-hmm. And if it has that kind of an impact, that's not something that you just see and, okay, an angel told me that he was risen. Oh, okay, well, I get that. Now let me go tell someone. I mean, you still have 100 things going through your mind about what does this mean? And so I think, yeah, they're on their way back, but they're probably asking a whole lot of new questions now.
Yeah.
Gone are the questions about where's the body and did somebody come and take it? Now there are a whole bunch of new questions that aren't going to be answered really quickly. And I think that's a part of, so now if this is true, what does it mean for my life and my future as well? So I think that was probably a big part of it. And Jesus doesn't answer those questions. I think he's kind of telling them it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. And here, you know, it bears out that when we are thinking about the story of the resurrection as told from any of the gospel writers, that the women happen to be the ones who were the first to announce the resurrection. Actually, I think actually comes to us as a means to say, listen, if we wanted to make up a story about resurrection and we wanted it to be believable, we probably would have found the leaders of the group to be the ones to tell the story, the ones to be the first eyewitnesses, the ones to communicate. That's just not how this works. And I know growing up, frankly, that that was sort of an unemphasized point. I don't think it was maybe deliberate. I don't know. But I do think that it shows up in all of the Gospels is important because it's so unbelievable a story that the things that are included would be unbelievable in that day. The idea that a woman would testify to a thing and be given immediate credibility by anyone was foreign. And so here, those who want to appeal to a story that's made up, a story that, well, you know, it's a spiritualized event, it didn't really happen, you know, you just don't make up stories like this. And so it has a number of compelling consequential notions to it, but here it's really, really important that the central characters that morning, when they learned of the resurrection, were among the unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that they were asking to believe something they couldn't believe, and then tell something nobody would believe. You just don't make this sort of thing up. So when we start thinking about that and how we talk to folks about the resurrection and our conviction that it was real, material, what are some, are there any other takeaways from these verses here that we've already layered the earthquake and the potential symbol of the angel sitting on the stone, the unbelievability of the events because of our preconceived ideas just are so rock hard in our heads, and here that we've got the account of women who would not be the believable. Do you see any other thing underlying or anything kind of explicit that we would be able to point to as well to say, this is a real thing? Or if that's, if we think we've covered it all, I mean, what is the import for? Let me ask the question this way. So, what is the value of the physicality of the resurrection?
Well, I'll be honest with you. That's something that I have not experienced emphasized a lot throughout my life, or even considered a lot throughout my life. As someone who grew up in church and as a believer from an early age. But I think one of the profound things that it does is it really connects what Jesus has done to this life now. This life is not just, well, let's make do until we finally one day escape to the really good stuff in heaven. But that if Jesus was resurrected into this world, if he rose in a bodily form that is native to this world, yeah, I mean, his resurrection body had some differences, yes, but it is integral in, can't say it, integrally tied to this life, and it really infuses a lot of meaning into what you and I do day to day in this life, in this world. It's not Christianity is not an escapist religion. It's not something that we're just dealing with the here and now until one day we can get away from it and get to something that is real and better. It's that God has come to rescue us in this world, in this life. And no, it's not perfect. And even once he rescues us, it doesn't immediately become perfect, but it's in a process of moving in that direction. We go from creation to new creation in our story. And in Revelation, the picture is not, at the end of the book, the picture is not of us ascending up to live in heaven forever, but it says, then I saw the New Jerusalem descending from the heavens and God coming down to live with man. That when God made this world and called it good, that it is good, and that he's coming to redeem it, and the things that we know about it. I actually find a lot of comfort in knowing that what I do in this life and the kind of life I live in this world, and the fun that I have in this world, whether it's going to golf or fish or whatever, is not just some temporary pleasure, but that God has created a good world and he's going to return us to that good world in the new creation that has a lot in common with the lives that we live right here and now.
Yeah, I I think that's probably a good place to end, and then and just emphasize that what we do has been given meaning, and that's everything. And so certainly we think that a time spent, online in the midst of a pandemic studying the scriptures is meaningful, but it's going to be just as meaningful when you take some time after, of course, watching the live stream, to have lunch with your family. If you have some things you need to do, albeit rainy and wet, but whatever it is, we've been given to do in and with these bodies. There's meaning, and it does matter, and that's probably like you. We grew up the same sort of kind of framework, obviously, that the materiality of our world, that is the embodied experience of our world, it was not terribly emphasized. It was more of an escape, and somehow we missed the end of the book, where the promise is reconciliation and restoration of all things, not just of our bodies, but of all things. And so when we start telling the good news and someone thinks we don't know how to have fun, our fun has meaning. That we think it's a good gift to have fun, a good gift to enjoy the bodies God has given us.
Yep.
And that is absent the resurrection. It just then becomes, pretty well nothing. So,
Yeah.
my dear friends who think that there'll be no fun because they have already locked away in their heads what they think it will be like, and they've so ingrained this expectation that they don't want to sing forever. Well, you're not doing that right now. So the idea that somehow that's going to now be our new reality, I hate to break it to Tyrone, but that was a line he often used. What we are going to experience will be not altogether different than what we experience now, but all of our relationships will be mended. Our world will be whole. I think it'll be funner. How's that?
Yep.
Well, listen, if that didn't give you something to think about on Resurrection Sunday, that your life has meaning, then we've recorded this so you can go back and try again. But until we get together, thank you for joining us online today. And we'll see you in just about 25 minutes. So I'm going to ask Paul if he'll pray us out.
God, we're thankful for the world that you've given us, but more than anything else, we're thankful that on that third day, Jesus rose from the dead to bring us new life and to begin to repair the world that has fallen into sin and brokenness, and that one day you will complete that work, and that you have in your loving graciousness included us in that, and we look forward to that day. And so as a result, we celebrate that today, and we're thankful that Jesus rose and that one day we too will rise from the dead as well. God, be with your people today as we struggle through an Easter like we've never had before. And yet the realities that we celebrate have not changed just because our circumstances have. And so we can still celebrate it in the same way, just in a different method, even if we're staying at home with those that are close to us. Lord, may the celebration be as great today as it ever has been. And we thank you for what you've done for us. And we pray it all in Jesus' name.
Amen. Till next time. See ya. Thanks.
I can't hear you now.
Let me stop the recording.
Oh, okay.